friends, and today we are going to learn about service contracts in Magento 2. And this is the backbone for Magento 2 and a very important concept as far as Magento's core understanding is concerned or both the developer exams concerned. We, we have collected certain pointers here that will be helping you in your exam, and I think couple of questions from in the exam will be from these pointers only. Now, first thing to note here is that this is a approach for designing the software application softwares, and when you see that Magento was started and Magento 2's development was started, they adopt this approach, and once they decided that they will be working based on the service contract approach, then only they were able to implement various design patterns that we have discussed so far or will be going to discuss in further lectures. So this is the root or the boilerplate for Magento 2, or we can say any software that uses service contract. And on top of that layer, we use various design patterns, and then our business logic, then our other logics, and then the capability to end user to customize, and so on. So this is in the very root and core of Magento, and let's go to the next pointer straight away. The service contract is actually a set of PHP interfaces that are defined for a module. Now, on high level, if you see, service contracts are actually nothing but the set of certain PHP interfaces uh, in your modules. Or if you see Magento's core, let's say for the customer module, you will see that there in module there is a folder named as API, and inside that there will be a couple of interfaces, and under the API module there will be, under the API folder there will be a folder named as data, and inside that there will be a couple of other interfaces as well. So service contracts are actually nothing as far as code's concerned, but are the interfaces. But whenever you talk about interfaces, there is a implementation for that particular interface. So when someone is going to implement that interface, they are bound that they will have to use the functionality that interface has decided for them, and that's how the contract begins. So hope you will understand why we call them service contracts. And in our Magento 2 there are interfaces that has been created by Magento's core team, or when we are going to create our custom modules, we will be creating couple of interfaces for ourselves, and then there will be their implementation mostly in the models for instance. Now, next thing to understand is that interfaces can be of couple of types, like data interfaces, service interfaces, and service interfaces are actually further divided into various types as well. But well, data interfaces actually work with the data integrity only, and the service interfaces actually work with business logic. So let's discuss the further one point, and then we will go to Magento's core. One service contract or a service contract must define data interface which preserve data integrity, and service interface which hides business logic from service requester. I'm sorry. Okay, so in order for something to be called a service contract in Magento 2, you should define two type of interfaces: service and data interfaces. And as discussed above, service interfaces for business logic and data interfaces for data integrity. Now let me go to our Magento install. I'll go to vendor folder, and inside that there is Magento folder, and inside that we have module module hyphen customer. Under module customer we have API folder. So all these here, for instance, you can assume that they are service contract, and whatever inside the data folder, all these interfaces are actually data interfaces. Now service interfaces can be further divided, which we will discuss in a while. But if you see that in customer module we have couple of interfaces here and inside data. So these interfaces always going to have some implementation, and that implementation mostly resides into models, and these models are linked to interfaces based on your di.xml file. So let me go to one di.xml, let's say frontend and di.xml. I'll open it and okay, and then let me see if you have, this is a preference. Okay, so we have this preference. Anything else? Anything? No, nothing much in here. Let me go to my global di.xml file. Yeah, there are lots of database. Let me search for API folder. Okay, lots of database. Now, as discussed in preferences, we have created a preference, or Magento have created a preference for Magento customer API address repository interface. So in API folder, this interface directly lies. This means this is a service interface. Okay, and type defines that where we are going to use the functionality of this interface: Magento customer model, and then resource model, and then address repository. Now in address repository class, we are going to implement address repository interface. Let me go to model and resource model and address repository class. uh, Model, resource model, address repository .php. I'm not going to open it in my NetBeans. So if you see that this class implements the class that has been mentioned here. Okay, so in Magento, let's discuss this again. In Magento we have modules, and inside module we have a API folder. Inside API folder we define two type of interface. One is service interface that directly lies inside API folder. Other are data interfaces that lies inside data folder. And if a module contains both of these type of interfaces, we can say that this module uses service contract in Magento 2. Now these interfaces are further settled or uh, defined in di.xml file, where we create the preferences for these interface, and then their implementation actually is going to lie in models always. And in our models we implement the interface, then our models are actually bound, or models has made some contract with this interface that whatever I am going to do, I will be doing everything within the limits that you have given to me. So this is why we call them service contract. Okay, now let me go to my presentation again. This is a very rough slide, I know, but the pointers are really very important. Now next we understand what is actually service contract look like and how Magento uses them. So if you see, this is like the top section is the entry points. You call something in Magento, you hit a controller, a third party hit a Magento's API, or some other modules want to interact with some other module or PHP client. They go always on the service contract layer or service contracts. Service contract has two types, and then service contract actually work with models and resource model. Models actually don't directly interact with databases, so service contract generally interact with models, and then model interact with resource model uses PDO to interact with database. They get the data sometimes in the collections and returns to the service contracts, and service contract returns further. So in a nutshell, you can see that service contract are a mediator layer. Now let's say you created a customer module, and for customers address you have a service contract that is going to further call models and resource model to interact with database. Now if you are going to implement a controller, you will be calling a service contract, so you can hide everything inside, and you can just worry about your functionality to call the service contract, or we call them APIs. web services use Magento's API. So this thing make actually everything loosely coupled and very easy to interact with Magento's module. Let's say Magento's address wants to interact with Magento's customer entity. The customer entity will interact with the address entity service contract and vice versa. So this is a layer which abstract everything that is complicated and pushes out what needs to be accessed or what data you may require. So this is why service contract has been created in Magento, and that's how they work. Now, a couple of key pointers are these, that service contract fulfill a number of important functions. First thing to note here is to improve the upgrade process. So whenever there is an upgrade in Magento's core or in your module that you're going to develop in future, so if you have worked with the service contract, you have access data using service contract, then your code is actually secure. Because when the Magento's core will updated, Magento's customer module is going to upgrade, their database changes, and based on that some changes in the implementation maker. But Magento has mentioned to us that for instance they will not be modifying the service contract until unless a major release has been dispatched out. So your code is upgrade proof, and the best approach to work with modules is to use service contracts only. Now, formalizing the customization process. This is again really very important. I'm sorry. This is again really very important. If you discuss about code development on very large scale or Fortune 100 client, they have lots and lots of systems interacting with each other. Now you just cannot allow everybody to directly interact with database and work however they want. So there is a formalization needed in the code, and service contract actually provides that. Now your implementation, your models are bound to be working accordingly the implementation, which are the interfaces that has been created. So it's kind of forcing your models to work as the interface indicates. Then the third one is decoupling modules, which means that you can interact between modules using their service contract layer, and one module is not hardly coupled, or let's say customer module and tax in Magento 1 are really very hard coupled, where if you going to disable customer module, the tax will malfunction. If you're going to disable tax module, the customer module will malfunction, because they were directly calling each other's models or each other's files. But here, if the tax module in Magento will call the service contract of customer module. Now if you disable the customer module and service contract will return the error, then loose coupling will allow that text module to either stop or not work properly, or sorry, to not show his functionality on front end. And decoupling means, again, you can dissect your code into couple of parts, where you have a layer for service contract and the other layer for their implementation and the other layer for visualizing the code on front end. Now other important thing is that service interfaces that we discussed earlier are divided into three type of sub interfaces: repository, management, and metadata. I wanted to show you these in these slides, but this is a high level overview, so I'll suggest you to go to dev docs of Magento and read about these. They are really good concepts. Mostly you will be working with repository and management interfaces, but sometimes in the metadata. And the customer module that we saw, when I told you that in customer module we have these service interfaces, I mentioned that we, for instance, let's call them service interfaces, because some are management interface. So account management interface, this is why the name is given as management interface. And if you see If you see this address repository interface, so the legacy name of the files are created based on the type of interface they are. This file has customer metadata management interface. So the name indicates what type of interface they are, but their actual use, I would give you this as a homework and just go to DevDocs, and they have really good explanation there. Now let me go to slides. So again, the F5 I think is the short key. Where am I? I'm sorry. Okay. Now the service contract implementation. Uh, these are the final pointers. I'm sure that one of these is going to be in the exam. First thing is Magento 2 operations can be divided between two groups, data and operational. So everything that is related to data will be tackled using data interfaces, and other are operational or business logic related that will be used for service contracts. So whenever you're going to implement a data interface in model, you will be creating a, you can create a subfolder named as resource model, because resource models are actually interact with data, and you can directly create your class inside model for service contract implementation. Now data API provide access to modules entity data, and this means that data APIs here are the CRUD operation for customer API, that are data APIs, and the customer is the entity. So Magento's default APIs for customer entity provides you CRUD operation, where CRUD instance for create, read, update and delete. So these type of operations are allowed by data APIs, and data APIs can be found in your modules API folder and inside the data folder as we have showed you. Now the next thing is the operational API do not provide data but drives the actual operation used on that data. These are related to logics, sometimes business logics, and sometimes other type of logic or base functionalities. Some people don't like to call them business logics, but we are dividing them into two parts. First one is the data and the other one is everything else. These APIs allow business operations to functions properly between modules, and the API usually includes the public methods of Magento 1 models and helpers. So again, let's say for customer entity you have CRUD operation which are provided by data API, but the operational API is where you forgot password, or a customer perform a forgot password functioning that is done using operational API. So now I think you will be able to distinguish between these two. The data API only expose CRUD method as already discussed, while the operational API actually does something else. Okay, the operational APIs for a module can be found inside the folder module name and API. So operational APIs are service contract and service contracts which are directly in API folder, and the data APIs are inside the data folder. So as discussed above, we have two types of service contracts, and data interfaces and service interfaces. So data interface is data API and service interfaces are operational API. So the name should be very clear, because your questions may jumble around with these names. In Magento 2 you can also now customize a module using API interface that communicates with the model without interacting directly with cores, a much safer approach. Now in Magento 2 compared to Magento 1, you can directly call the APIs that work with models, and you can make any modifications, whereas in Magento 1 you was not supposed to be directly interacting with something intermediate, but you was working with the model that actually inside call a resource model that further call something in code, then in gen, then in PDO or database adapter, then the read adapter, and then the connection adapter. So that was very long process in Magento 1, but in Magento 2 it's quite simple. You can use the APIs to work with any module. And that was all for this Service contract, we will be discussing their implementation and will be creating the APIs in further lecture. Till then, bye. Thank you.